Charter consent to discharge Subcommittee on Coast Guard Maritime Transportation for further consideration of H.R. 1322, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point without objection. So ordered. At that point, I would recognize myself. Predominantly located along the U.S. coastline, Coast Guard facilities and personnel are increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change with rising seas. However, the Coast Guard is the only, again, unique armed service yet to report on the potential impacts of climate change on its operations. Seeking parity with the other armed services, H.R. 1322 directs the Coast Guard to study its vulnerabilities to climate change, explore mitigation efforts. This study is the first step to ensuring that the Coast Guard is prepared for rising sea levels, extreme weather events caused by climate change, and I urge my colleagues on both sides to support this bill and enhance the Coast Guard's readiness in an era of changing seas. At this point, I would recognize Subcommittee Chair Maloney to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue as well. Climate change is a major concern across our country, across the world. Our armed forces need to be prepared to operate in a changing environment. By its nature, the Coast Guard has hundreds of properties and units located along the water's edge, which may be directly affected by climate change factors such as sea level rise, storm surge, high winds, and severe flooding. My bill directs the Commandant of the Coast Guard to provide a report to Congress on the vulnerabilities to Coast Guard installations and operational requirements resulting from climate change and related effects. This bill mirrors Section 335 of last year's NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which required the Secretary of Defense to submit a report to Congress on vulnerabilities to military installations and combatant commander requirements resulting from climate change. Per that report, we know that most facilities that were studied are vulnerable to climate change. You don't have to be an expert to recognize the Coast Guard facilities along our shorelines will be threatened. The question is not if the Coast Guard will be affected. The question is how seriously the threat will affect the Coast Guard and what steps we can take to protect our installations. I remind my colleagues that 3 major hurricanes that passed through the U.S. in 2017 resulted in damages to Coast Guard facilities totaling close to $1 billion. The risk is real, and it makes no sense for the Coast Guard to be unprepared or to operate in ignorance. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for the explanation. I would now recognize the ranking member, Representative Graves, for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 1322 requires a report from the Coast Guard to identify its 10 facilities that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and the mitigation that's going to be needed at these facilities. In February, however, the GAO reported that the Coast Guard has enormous construction and maintenance backlogs related to the service's shoreside facilities. The GAO has concluded that the Coast Guard lacked the criteria or a process to set priorities or develop an infrastructure plan based on the mission needs instead of the one-for-one replacement of existing facilities. I'd be happy to work with the majority to encourage or direct the Coast Guard to develop criteria for prioritizing shoreside construction and maintenance projects in ways that best promote the mission's effectiveness. Such criteria and their implementation should be a comprehensive and not driven by any single or one single factor. And in making improvements to the Coast Guard shoreside facility construction and maintenance program, resilience in areas prone to coastal storms and flooding should be one consideration, but so should all other factors that impact the Coast Guard mission effectiveness. Unfortunately, I can't support H.R. 1322 given its limited scope and potential for skewing the Coast Guard's infrastructure plans in ways that don't promote the most effective results for the service's ability to carry out its many important missions, and hope we can address these concerns as we develop the bipartisan Coast Guard authorization bill later this year. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Anyone else wish to be recognized, make a statement?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I'm someone somewhere. Oh, there.
This is a
recognize
good
gentleman from Alaska.
This is a good bill, but I was here when we first started. What the Coast Guard only had to do was buoy attendants, some navigational aids, and some rescue efforts. And we've gone every time we've authorized in this committee to do something, and we haven't pursued the funding. I don't know how much it's going to cost, but I want to make sure that we go to the committees, appropriation committees, we fund the money so they don't take away money in their major efforts. Right now, you know, we passed a drug legislation, we passed OPA, and we didn't fund them, and they've been underfunded. So we have to take and pursue that, this committee, the other committees, so we don't take away from their maiden duty. So I just wanted to bring that up.
I thank the gentleman, and I share his concern about the chronic underfunding of the Coast Guard, and would hope that we can persuade our colleagues on the Budget Committee and others to allow us to appropriate, to authorize during the coming authorization a more robust level that more fully meets their needs. Any other members wish to be recognized? Okay, hearing none, I would now say, are there any amendments to the bill? Okay. Whoop. Do we have one? Okay. Yes. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment stems from a fairly simple premise. When it comes to our nation's security, we shouldn't outsource the work.
Could the gentleman just add, you got to follow the rigmarole here.
I do have an amendment at the desk. Sorry about that.
You're asking unanimous consent to the amendment to be considered as read, and now the clerk will announce the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1322, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania.
Okay, now we would love to have the gentleman explain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your guidance.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment stems from a fairly simple premise. When it comes to our nation's security, we shouldn't outsource the work to organizations that do not prioritize the interests of the American people. The UN IPCC clearly does not share our priorities and oftentimes is openly hostile to the United States. Using their products to inform our security policies puts our nation at a strategic disadvantage. This reality is bolstered by the influence of our adversaries, China and Russia, and the influence that they have in the IPCC process. The IPCC includes both Chinese and Russian climate models, and in their modeling suite, allowing them to influence the report's projected outcomes. Even worse, the IPCC approval process for the summary for policymakers allows any member nation to object to a conclusion and demand changes. The IPCC then amends the underlying report to ensure consistency with the summary. Since the summary is typically released before the report itself, the full extent of these changes is unknowable. It is wholly inappropriate to use information subject to this much enemy influence for the purpose of determining security policy. The strategic disadvantage is further enhanced by the fact that neither the Chinese nor Russians appear to be taking the IPCC's claims of catastrophic global warming very seriously. This is made clear by the emissions reductions plan submitted during the Paris Agreement. China's carbon emissions reduction plan does not go into effect until 2030. As a matter of fact, their projected business-as-usual emission peak, and even then, the reductions are less than business-as-usual scenario. Russia's plan actually reported increases in its emissions. Given the overtly hostile actions by both Russia and China in recent years, it is suicidal as a nation to base our security policy decisions on information subject to the influence of adversaries that even they don't find credible enough to rely on for their own purposes. Aside from the foreign influence, the performance of the IPCC's modeling suite has rendered the suite and all information based on its result not credible for policy analysis. Matter of fact, Dr. John Christie, the head of climate research at the University of Alabama at Huntsville, conducted research on the efficacy of the suite's predictions and found, on average, they overpredicted measured temperatures by more than a factor of 3. Given the widespread usage of the IPCC modeling projections, including use as the scientific base for the 4th National Climate Assessment, this finding is extremely alarming. Clearly, the projections produced by these models are not representative of reality. Security policies must be informed by credible data from sources free from the various purposes. For the sake of national security, we can and must do better than the IPCC products. The lives of the American people depend on it, and I yield.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. I'll say that I'm I agree with some of the shortcomings of the, our competitor nations around the world and potentially the United States under this administration in meeting our obligations to reduce carbon pollution and accelerate, climate change. We could, and the Science Committee has more jurisdiction than us to debate the facts regarding climate change. But I'll say that China and Russia would ignore this totally at their own peril and to our advantage because they may find some of their strategic bases to be flooded and their naval forces unable to deploy or their air force unable to deploy or their military. And if we, as we are doing with the Marines, the Air Force, and the Navy and the Army, they have all, come to conclusions regarding the need to construct and reconstruct our facilities to deal with climate change. The NDAA included a provision that required DOD to construct a critical infrastructure 3 feet above base flood elevation and non-critical infrastructure at 2 feet above base flood elevation. Yet at this point, the Coast Guard has no directives nor plan to deal with what all other military forces are dealing with. Just last week, Nebraska flooding had a significant impact on runway operations at Offutt Air Force Base, home of our the SAC, Strategic Air Command, to see the wisdom of providing for these climatic events in order that we can better defend the United States of America. So I would oppose the gentleman's amendment and recognize other members who wish to speak.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your comments, and I would concur. The gentleman's amendment is a solution in search of a problem. The bill requires a study. There's nothing in the bill that requires it in any way to be bound or to follow IPCC conclusions or models. It's a bit of a non sequitur, although I do share the gentleman's concern for reality, so I just wanted to inject some into this conversation. I urge my colleagues to oppose it.
Any others wishing to be recognized? Yes, the gentleman from New Jersey.
I fully agree with.
Tom, I don't think your mic's on. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, okay. Better, a little closer.
I fully second your remarks, Mr. Chairman, and would just want to say for the record that the IPCC draws its recommendations from the work of thousands of climate scientists around the world, most of whom work in the United States or in countries that are allied with the United States. And the notion that these scientists are somehow under enemy influence is something that I find deeply offensive. I would urge my colleague to either withdraw that allegation or to back it up with hard facts. Thank you.
Other members?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Yes. The gentleman is recognized.
Representative Davids from Kansas 3rd. I just wanted to reiterate that the Coast Guard, and specifically the Commandant of the Coast Guard, I believe, has the wherewithal and the discernment to decide whether or not reports are accurate and should be taken into account when deciding what threats exist or don't exist to various facilities and bases. In fact, I might be mistaken, but I believe the Commandant has a civil engineering degree and probably has a decent amount of experience in deciding whether or not the IPCC or any other study should be used when deciding what threats to our national security exist. And for that reason, I wouldn't support this amendment.
I thank the gentlelady. Other comments on the amendment? Hearing none. Okay. Then are there amendments to the amendment? Hearing none. Then we'll move forward. The question is on the amendment. Those are in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. 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 In the judgment of the chair, the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
All right. The recorded vote was requested. Is there a, I don't know what a sufficient second means, but is there a sufficient second, which I don't think is too many? Okay. Is that sufficient?
Yeah,
I'm talking my
Mr. Chairman,
parliamentary-
point of order. I don't know that we need seconds for recorded votes.
I don't know.
In fact, I can tell you from a rules
Well, I
standpoint, we don't
I
need
know.
seconds for
Yeah,
recorded votes.
I don't think so either, but whatever. Anything we can do to obstruct the progress here. The recorded vote is called. A sufficient number of members have requested a recorded vote. A recorded vote is ordered. I think we have sufficient members here to move forward with a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. DeFazio.
No.
Mr. DeFazio votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Ms. Johnson of Texas.
No.
Ms. Johnson of Texas votes no. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Larson of Washington. Mr. Larson of Washington votes no. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Sires. Mr. Sires votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Carson of Indiana. Mr. Carson of Indiana votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Sean Patrick Maloney of New York. Mr. Sean Patrick Maloney of New York votes no. Mr. Huffman. Ms. Brownlee of California. Ms. Brownlee of California votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Brown of Maryland. No. Mr. Brown of Maryland votes no. Mr. Espelot. No. Mr. Espelot votes no. Mr. Malinowski. No. Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Marcuso Powell.
No.
Ms. Marcuso Powell votes no. Mrs. Fletcher. Mr. Allred. No. Mr. Allred votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas.
No.
Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Ms. Finkenauer.
No.
Ms. Finkenauer votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. No. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Delgado. No. Mr. Delgado votes no. Mr. Pappas. No. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mrs. Craig. No. Mrs. Craig votes no. Mr. Rauda. No. Mr. Rauda votes no. Mr. Graves of Missouri. Aye. Mr. Graves of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Young. Aye. Mr. Young votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Aye. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Mr. Gibbs. Aye. Mr. Gibbs votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Yay. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mr. Massey. Aye. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Meadows. Aye. Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Perry. Aye. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Davids of Illinois. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Katko. No. Mr. Katko votes no. Mr. Babin. Yes. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. No. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Rouser. Aye. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Mr. Bost. Aye. Mr. Vost votes aye. Mr. Weber of Texas.
Aye.
Mr. Weber of Texas votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Aye. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Aye. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mr. Smucker. Aye. Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Mr. Mast. No. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Gallagher. No. Mr. Gallagher votes no. Mr. Palmer. Aye. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Ms. Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico. Mr. Balderson. Aye. Mr. Balderson votes aye. Mr. Spano. Aye. Mr. Spano votes aye. Mr. Stopper. Mr. Stopper votes aye. Mrs. Miller. Aye. Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Lipinski.
No.
Mr. Lipinski votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Payne. Ms. Plaskett. Mr. Lynch. Mrs. Fletcher. Mr. Davis of Illinois. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Fitzpatrick. Ms. Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico.
Are there any members who have not recorded who wish to be recorded? Does the clerk have the tally? While the clerk is tallying, I will say to the committee and to the clerk that it's the tradition of this committee to alternate sides when we go through a vote. I know that this is your first roll call, but in the future, we will go in order of seniority on each side, and that's the way the committee has always done it. So with that, do you have the results?
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 yeas and 33 noes.
Okay. The amendment is not adopted. We would then, are there further amendments to the bill? If not, the question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting of H.R. 1322 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. Okay, the ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Now, well, hopefully you could hear me. You don't want me to repeat myself. Anyway, we're doing 1306. I would ask the subcommittee chair to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank